This lecture on Introduction to Inductive Logic is for my logic and critical thinking students at Golden West College, and I'm Dr. Hill. This lecture will review some items for deductive logic. We're going to compare that to inductive logic, and we're going to bring a few items from rhetoric along the way with it. Let's review. Remember, deductive validity is the key concept in deductive logic. If we say that an argument is valid, or if we're outside of logic class, to be clear about what we mean, if we say that an argument is deductively valid, this means that the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. In other words, if every premise is true, then the conclusion must absolutely positively also be true. We can also say that the premises provide complete or 100% support for the conclusion. We could also say that when the premises are true, it is logically impossible for the conclusion to be false. Right? These are all different ways we can express the idea of validity. In logic class, we're just going to call this validity. Outside of logic class, sometimes we'll call this deductive validity, so that the people will understand that we're using validity in its strictly logical sense, and not in just the everyday sense that might just mean a good argument. Okay. Now, if an argument remember, some arguments are deductive and some arguments are not. If an argument purports to be deductive, if the argument claims to be valid, then it is a deductive argument, right? And so we're going to classify arguments by deductive or inductive. We're going to classify inductive by the inferential claim of the argument. That is, how well does the argument claim to support the conclusion? And when we have an argument that claims to support the conclusion completely, that it claims to be a deductive argument, we're going to evaluate it using the tools of deductive logic. Okay, there are more tools of deductive logic coming later in this class, right? We're going to learn the tools of categorical logic and then sentence logic coming up after the midterm. But when an argument is deductive, we're going to ask, is it valid? That is, do the premises indeed completely support the conclusion? And is it sound? That is it valid? And if so, are the premises true? Notice that deductive arguments are the focus of math. Mathematicians like to prove things. Okay? Mathematicians also use inductive logic, but their focus is on deductive logic. They like proofs. Okay? And there's a number of indicators which we can often look at in an argument which indicates that the arguer believes that she's offering a deductive argument. If she says something like, which proves that, it follows with certainty that, with 100% probability. If they say something is proven, or we can be sure that, or it must then be the case that, right? Notice that then it's probably the case that the person believes that she's offering a deductive argument. Notice that these deduction indicators are, for the most part, also conclusion indicators, right? So these are conclusion indicators in a deductive argument. Okay. Notice, though, that not all arguments are inductive. Not all arguments are deductive. Some arguments are inductive, right? Not all arguments do or even claim to support their conclusions completely. That is, the inferential claim, the claim about how well they support the conclusion, is less than that for a deductive argument. And these arguments are called inductive. And inductive logic is the study of invalid arguments. And we're going to evaluate these using the tools of inductive logic. Now, for inductive logic, if we really want to get into inductive logic, we have to get into probability theory. But class, I'm sorry to tell you, okay, we don't have time to cover probability theory in our class. I know you're disappointed. Okay, I know you're disappointed that you would love to get into some deeper math, especially Bayes' theorem in our class. And as much as I love that mathematics, I had to make some choices along the way for this class of what we can include and what not to. So I decided simply we're going to skip probability theory. You can get that in a mathematics class if you're really interested. Okay, so I know you're disappointed, but just take it easy. You'll be okay. We're still going to learn a lot of stuff in this class. Okay, notice that inductive arguments are generally the focus of science. Right? Scientists seek confirmation rather than proof. Now, I don't want to oversimplify it because scientists also use deductive arguments. Even so, inductive arguments are the focus of science. Just like mathematics focuses on deductive arguments, even though they also use inductive arguments, right? So both math and science have both, but one of the reasons that math and science are considered as different academic fields is because of the emphasis in mathematics on deductive proofs and the emphasis in science on inductive support. Okay. There are a number of words and phrases that indicate where an arguer can indicate that she's offering an inductive argument. That is, she acknowledges that she's giving you reason to believe the conclusion, but she's acknowledging that she hasn't completely proven it, right? She's not giving you 100% support. Probably the most common induction indicator is probably. Okay? Some other induction indicators of inductive arguments are likely, to a high degree of confidence, more likely than not, almost surely, almost certainly, or with some probability where the probability given is something less than, strictly less than 100%. Now, fairness, now here we're going to come to an important key technical term in our class, a term for which you are responsible, and that's the term of fairness, right? So you should be fair to an argument. To be fair to an argument, you should interpret the argument as intended by its author. That is, read the argument in context. Now, to be fair, we don't misinterpret the argument to be weaker than it really is, even if you disagree with the conclusion, right? So we don't misinterpret it, we interpret it. But, to be fair, we don't fix an obviously flawed argument, even when you agree with the conclusion, even when you agree with the conclusion, okay? But, okay, I want you to apply the principle of charity that's coming up in a few slides before you conclude that the argument is flawed. Okay? And remember, fairness is a different principle, but it's related to charity. Okay? So, since we're right now trying to figure out whether an argument is inductive or deductive, we should be fair to the inferential claim. That means, if the argument claims to be deductive, treat it as deductive, right? If we see an indication that it's a deductive argument, if we see a deduction indicator, evaluate the argument for validity using the tools that we're going to be learning about in this class. Okay? That is, that the argument claims to prove that if the argument claims to prove the conclusion, let's see if it does. Okay? And if the argument claims to be inductive, treat it as inductive, right? Evaluate it for strength using the tools of inductive logic. Okay? And that means that we want to recognize some of the common inductive forms, which are coming up in a couple of slides. And also that you might apply probability theory for math classes. Okay? Remember that in this class, I'm trying to teach you as much inductive logic as I can without getting into the math. Okay? Anyway, in other words, when we're evaluating an inductive argument, we're going to see if an argument that claims to support the conclusion, we're going to see how well the argument really does support the conclusion. Okay, now, notice there's a problem. You might be asking, well, wait a second, what if the argument doesn't say whether it's an inductive or a deductive argument? There's the problem, right? Probably most arguments, maybe it's very common, okay, maybe most arguments have no indicator that says whether they're deductive or inductive, right? So we can't tell from the way the argument is presented. What do we do then? Well, in that case, we're to apply the next principle, the principle of charity, okay? Being charitable to an argument means we give the argument the benefit of the doubt. In other words, we're going to resolve any ambiguity in favor of the argument. In other words, if there are two interpretations, we're going to choose the one that makes the argument look better. Notice that charity is another technical term in our class for which you are responsible, and it's something we should strive for when we're evaluating sources, especially when we disagree, right? It's easy to be charitable to a source when we agree with it. It's more challenging to be charitable when we disagree, okay? Remember also that charity is not the same thing as fairness, even though they are related virtues. Here is a famous ambiguous passage. It's a passage you've all read that's easily misinterpreted, and here it comes. All men are created equal. Now, there are some possible, that's an important expression, but there are some uncharitable interpretations that you might consider, right? Consider this. Men, but not women, have equality. Okay? I'm going to argue, okay, that Jefferson was using the male embraces the female rule. That is, when he wrote that, he was using the old rule where the male embraces the female. That just means that words like he, him, man, mankind should encompass men and women together. Okay, that the male embraces the female. That's the old rule. That rule has fallen out of favor. I don't recommend that you use that in your writing anymore, but Okay, 200 odd years ago, that was the rule. If you look at style manuals 50 years old and older, you'll probably see that, but you don't see it anymore. Okay, so but nonetheless, since they did use the word men, you could interpret it uncharitably to include men just meaning those of the male sex and not of the female sex. Here's another possible uncharitable interpretation: everybody is equally good at everything. The problem with that, well, what do you think? If everybody's equally good at everything, okay, that means, okay, that I can run as fast, since I'm a man, okay, and everybody's equally good at everything, I can run as fast as Usain Bolt, and that I'm as handsome as Brad Pitt, okay? Okay, well, sorry to say, but neither of those things is true, okay? However, those things aren't charitable interpretations, right? If to interpret this saying charitable, that all men are created equal, you need to read the thing in context, right? And if you read the Declaration of Independence in full, it'll prevent the ridiculous interpretations that I've given you above, right? Because Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." And then he goes on to list what some of those rights are. Okay, that's the equality is in terms of the rights that we're endowed with, not everybody being equally good at everything. Okay, so those are uncharitable passages. Now, sometimes when I've lectured students on this, and I've raised this famous passage, and I ask for an uncharitable interpretation, some students say, "Aha, here's an uncharitable interpretation: all white men are created equal." That's actually not uncharitable, that's unfair, okay, because here's the difference, right? It clearly says men, okay, and there's no way to interpret that all men are created equal. If you're interpreting all white men are created equal, you're adding something that's not there. You're bringing something that's in there to make it look much worse than it really is. It's actually a profound statement. Now, you might say, wait a second, right? Didn't Jefferson own slaves? He did, but he knew it was wrong. Okay? And in fact, in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, on the laundry list of complaints against the British, one was for bringing one complaint was about slavery. Now, in order for the Declaration to be ratified, he had to drop that. They had to drop that. So the final official version of the Declaration that you've all read did not have that in the laundry list of complaints, but it originally did. Okay? Jefferson knew that he was doing a bad thing when withholding slaves. Okay? He knew that. And so he could have written all white men are created equal, but he didn't. He wrote all men are created equal, quite aware that he was being a hypocrite when he wrote that. Okay? So remember that interpretation would be unfair, not uncharitable. Let's continue. Now, going back to charity, when going back to evaluating arguments in general, we want to apply charity to the inferential claim. If an argument claims to be neither inductive or deductive, if it doesn't say what it is, we're going to interpret charitably. That is, if the argument is valid, that is, if we recognize or we can demonstrate a valid form, we're going to evaluate it and otherwise treat it as a deductive argument. If the argument is invalid, we're going to evaluate it as an inductive argument if we can. Okay? And if we recognize an inductive form, we have a couple of inductive forms coming up in a few slides, then we recognize that it's an inductive form, and we're going to evaluate it as an inductive argument. We're not going to pretend that it's a deductive argument. Okay? The main concept in inductive logic is strength and weakness, right? These correspond to the deductive terms of validity and invalidity. And other inductive terms are reliability, which is cogency in some logic books, and unreliability or uncogency in some logic books, right? These correspond to the deductive terms of soundness and unsoundness. Let's look at them, okay? Inductive strength. If we say that an argument is strong, or if outside of logic class we say that the argument is inductively strong, this means that if every premise is true or acceptable, okay, then the conclusion is more likely than not also true or acceptable, but possibly false or unacceptable. Okay, remember that in iLogic he's using true and false for factual claims, and acceptable or unacceptable for claims of value. Okay, so here's a question: can a valid argument be strong? Think about this for a minute. This is a question you might see on an exam. True or false, a valid argument can be strong. Look at the definition above and tell me. Okay, and if you think you know the answer, go ahead and post it on our discussion board. Okay, now, inductive weakness. If we say that an argument is weak, or outside of logic class, if we say that an argument is inductively weak, that means the argument is invalid but not strong. In other words, we're saying that if every premise is true, then the conclusion is just as likely or more than likely to be false. Okay? Now, the other terms that we're looking at in inductive logic are reliability and unreliability. Okay? Remember, iLogic uses the terms reliability and unreliability. Some other logic books use the words cogent and uncogent. They mean the same thing. Okay? If we say that an argument is reliable or cogent, that means exactly two things, no more, no less. The two things are, one, that the argument is strong, and two, that every premise is true. Okay? And if an argument is invalid but not reliable, then it's unreliable or uncogent. So if we say that an argument is unreliable or uncogent, that means the argument is invalid and not reliable, or in other words, that the argument is strong with a false premise, with at least one false premise, or weak regardless of its premises. Now, let's look at, now that we've learned some of the terms of inductive logic, let's take a look at our first inductive form, and this form is called statistical syllogism. It's a syllogism, so it has exactly two premises. Remember, that's what syllogism means. A syllogism means an argument with two premises, and here is the standard form of the argument. It's not, when I give you this form, I'm giving you this form in stilted logic book language, okay? When you see when you encounter the argument in real life, it's not always going to sound exactly like this, but this is what the argument sounds like, the form of the argument, right? We have some percentage, I'm going to call it X. X percent of members of group A are also members of group B. C, the second premise is that C, some object is a member of group A, so C is also a member of group B. Now, this is a strong form, so we need this percentage to be strictly greater than 50% and strictly less than 100%, right? If it's 50% or less, the argument would be weak, and if the argument were equal to 100%, it would be a valid argument, right? But notice, we don't always have to use a percentage. We can sometimes use an equivalent generality, right? A generality expression such as most, the majority of, or almost all, or similar expressions which mean the same thing as more than 50% but less than 100%. Now that I've given you the definition, I need to give you an example. So here is an example statistical syllogism. Here we go. 75% of Golden West College students download music. Bill is a Golden West College student, so Bill downloads music. Here's the questions that we want to ask about the argument. Is the argument valid or invalid? Think about that for a minute. Is it strong or weak? And is it a statistical syllogism? Okay. I hope you see, by the percentage being less than 100%, it is invalid, but by being greater than 50%, it's a strong argument, and thus it is a statistical syllogism. Okay, let's continue. So let's vary the argument. We're going to take a look at what happens when we change the argument around a little bit, right? We're going to do a couple of things in this lecture with this argument to see what happens. Okay, now, consider this. 90% of Golden West College students download music. Bill is a Golden West College student, so Bill downloads music. Okay, so here is the argument. Valid or invalid? It's still invalid, right? Is it strong or weak? It's still strong, right? Is it a statistical syllogism? It still is, right? Do you see that? Now, is it stronger or weaker than the previous argument? Notice that it's stronger. Notice that this, right now, we can see one thing that makes inductive logic different than deductive logic, right? Validity is all or nothing, but strength comes in degrees. This argument is stronger than the previous one. Let's look at the next one. Now, 25% of Golden West students download music. Bill is a Golden West student, so Bill downloads music. Now, is this argument valid or invalid? Still invalid, right? Is the argument strong or weak? Now the argument is weak. Is it a statistical syllogism? Well, not by the definition that we're using. So in our class, we're going to say no. It's no longer a statistical syllogism, but if you have a different logic book, they could give a different answer. Some logic books would still call this a statistical syllogism. I used to use a logic book that actually defined it both ways. Okay? Now, is it stronger or weaker than the previous argument? Notice, I hope you can easily see that it's weaker than both versions of the previous argument that we just saw. Here's another question. Does it provide any support for the conclusion? Yes, it does. So even though the argument is weak, it's still possible for a weak argument to provide some support. We'd probably estimate the support here at about 25%. Here we learn that at least downloading music is the kind of thing that a student might do, right? We don't have good reason we wouldn't say that Bill probably does, but we could say that he might, based on the information that we have here. Okay, now, here's a tricky case. 50% of Golden West students download music. Bill is a Golden West student, so Bill downloads music. Is the argument valid or invalid? Well, it's still invalid, right? Okay. Is it strong or weak? Now, students sometimes get confused, and you might just have to memorize that. But here's how we're gonna say this. Right? This argument is weak, and here's how we reason that. At 50%, the conclusion is at this point still just as likely false as true. So we have not shown the conclusion to be more likely true than false, so this is officially a weak argument. And because it's not greater than 50%, it's no longer a statistical syllogism under the definition that we're using in our class. But it is stronger than the previous weak argument, or the previous argument had it at 50%, so even though this is still weak, it's stronger than the previous weak argument that we just saw. Now, let's change this just a little bit. 50.1% of Golden West students download music. Bill is a Golden West student, so Bill downloads music. Okay, now, notice that this argument, well, it's still invalid, but notice that now, is it strong or weak? It's strong, right? Now it's strong, and so it is a statistical syllogism. It's not very strong, right? But it's still, the conclusion, based on the information we have, is slightly more likely to be true than false. So now it's a strong argument, okay? And so it's stronger than the previous argument that we just saw. Let's vary it one more time. 100% of Golden West students download music. Bill's a Golden West student, so Bill downloads music. Now, what is this argument? This argument is valid, right? This argument is valid, so it's neither strong nor weak, and so it is not a statistical syllogism. It is a valid syllogism. And I guess a valid argument is in a way stronger than strong, so I guess you could say that it's stronger, but I'd rather we just say that it's valid, which is stronger than strong. Okay, so notice from this lesson we got a couple lessons to learn about the difference between inductive and deductive logic. Notice that validity is all or nothing, right? An argument is either valid or it's not valid, right? There's no in between, nothing in between validity or invalidity, but strength comes in degrees, right? So some arguments are stronger or weaker than other arguments, okay? Notice that a weak argument can still provide some support, okay? So that's another difference. Normally we'd say an invalid argument, the premises don't support it at all, or they may not support it at all, but if the argument is weak, it's possible that there is some support. Okay. Now, notice we're going to look at some common inductive forms. We just looked at statistical syllogism. The other ones we're going to talk about are appeal to authority, argument from analogy, inference to the best explanation, and induction by enumeration. Okay? None of these argument forms are valid, but all of them are useful arguments that we all use sometimes, as we should. Right? There's really nothing wrong with any of these argument forms. Just because they're invalid, we just need to recognize that these are inductive argument forms. Let's go. First one I want to talk about is appeal to authority. Right? This says that something is true and should be believed because someone who is or should be knowledgeable says so, right? Anytime you're saying somebody says that something is true because somebody says so, that's an appeal to authority, right? The standard form, okay, and again, remember, this is the stilted logic book language. We hear arguments to authority all the time, but this is the stilted logic book language. So that source R is a reliable authority about the subject matter of X. Okay, that just says they're knowledgeable. The premise 2 says R sincerely asserts that X is true. That is, R says that X is true, and she's not lying and she's not joking. Okay? And therefore, what we conclude is just X, namely that X is true. Notice that statement 1 is usually not explicitly stated. right? Usually people say you wouldn't even mention authority if they're not reliable. So usually they just say somebody says that something is true, and the assumption is that this person is a reliable authority, even though that's not always true. But let's continue. I hope you can see that the argument, I should take penicillin, I hope you can see that the argument is not valid because it's possible that your doctor could be mistaken, right? I'm sorry to tell you, but doctors make mistakes just like everybody else. Okay, so, because imagine now if you have an allergy to penicillin, this would be a big mistake, right? If doctor says, well, here's a prescription for penicillin, right? And he gives it to you, and you can't, before you look at that, you say, well, hey, doctor, maybe I should have told you that I'm allergic to penicillin. Well, if that happens, the doctor is going to grab the prescription out of your hand and tear it up, right? Because he made a mistake, right? He should have asked you, are you allergic to penicillin? By the way, they always do, right? Doctors are very good about doing that. But in my story, the doctor made a mistake. And just because the doctor said something in this case doesn't mean that it's true. It could be quite wrong. Now, arguments from authority are important, and we all need to use them sometime because of something that's called the epistemic division of labor. Okay, that's a mouthful. There's a philosophical concept. Okay, but here it is. Let me kind of talk about what those words mean. Epistemic means having to do with knowledge, and in philosophy, epistemology is the study of knowledge. Okay, so that's where the word epistemic and division of labor simply says that different people have different jobs which they specialize in, and then they get really good at it. Okay, Adam Smith, in his great work, The Wealth of Nations, pointed out that this is one reason that we're as wealthy as we are. Okay? Notice that pretty much every society has a division of labor. Even hunter-gatherers have a division of labor. Generally, the men hunted and the women gathered. So even the most primitive human societies have a division of labor. But hunter-gatherers are chronically poor. Our society is very rich because we have, one reason is because we have so much of a more division of labor, right? Different people know different things, okay? Different people do different things, and they specialize in them. The epistemic division of labor says that different people have the jobs of knowing different things, right? A wealthy nation like ours requires a lot more knowledge than can fit into a single head, and we all benefit from knowledge that other people have, things that we don't know ourselves, but that other people know. So, I want to point out that appealing to authority is not a fallacy when the authority is genuinely knowledgeable in the subject of interest. Okay? All of us have to appeal to authority sometimes because all of us have to rely on knowledge that's in other people's heads because we can't fit all the knowledge we need into our own heads. Okay? So there's nothing wrong with appealing to authority as long as the authority is reliable. It's not always a very interesting argument, okay? So you don't want to be given a 10-page term paper and says, well, this is true because the Encyclopedia Britannica says so and turn it in, okay? That's a lame paper, okay? So it's not always a very interesting argument, but it's an argument that sometimes we need. And in fact, whenever we cite a source, we're basically saying, I believe this because I consider, say, the New York Times or Encyclopedia Britannica to be a reliable authority. Okay, our next inductive form is argument from analogy, right? Argument from analogy argues that things that are similar in some respects are similar in other respects as well, right? So here's the form. Again, this form is the Stilted Logic book form. I'm going to give you some examples which should make it a little more clear, okay? Thing 1 and thing 2 are alike in similar relevant respects. Thing 1 has property P, so our conclusion is that thing 2 also has that same property P. Okay, let me give you some examples so it doesn't sound weird. Okay, Sleepless in Seattle and You've Got Mail are both romantic comedies directed and co-written by Nora Ephron, starring Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. And you liked Sleepless in Seattle. Okay, based on those premises, what's your best conclusion of how you'd feel about You've Got Mail? Well, you would probably predict that you will like You've Got Mail. Seemed like a reasonable conclusion, right? Now, here's the question. Is this argument valid or invalid? Remember, if we say that the argument is valid, that means that if the premises are true, that absolutely positively guarantees that the conclusion has to be true. So, by the way, premise 1 is correct. I'm just going to give you that. That happens to be true. But if you liked Sleepless in Seattle, does that absolutely positively guarantee that you will like You've Got Mail? Well, no, it doesn't, right? It's possible that you could like one movie and dislike another. And I've used this as an example in lectures. And occasionally I've found a student who liked one but not the other. So the argument is invalid. However, I think you'll agree with me that it's a strong argument. Yeah, if you liked one, I think there's a good chance that you'll like the other and at least find it to be worth watching, or at least beginning to watch it. Okay? Now, however, right, so that was a decent argument from analogy, but let me give you another example. Okay? Doctors diagnosing diseases are similar to students taking exams in that they're both trying to solve difficult problems. Doctors diagnosing diseases should be and are allowed to consult books, the internet, and other doctors. So, students taking exams should be allowed to consult books, the internet, and other students. Okay, well, the argument is clearly invalid. Arguments from analogy are always invalid, but I think that this one's probably weak, right? Because the relevant things, because there are some similarities between doctors diagnosing diseases and students taking exams, but there's some important differences as well, such as the whole point of doctors diagnosing diseases is to get the patient to feel better, right? It's to the health of the patient. Where students taking exams, we're really trying to test the knowledge, see how much the teachers. A better comparison would be doctors in medical school taking exams, and then I think we might come to a different conclusion. Here's an even more absurd argument from analogy. Okay? Nails are similar to employees in that they hold businesses together. Nails must be hit on the head in order for them to work. So, employees must be hit on the head in order for them to work. Now, I think you can see right now that the argument is invalid, and I hope you can see that it's weak. And the reason this is weak is even though it's an argument from analogy, you'll see that the argument, the similarities are really not at all relevant to the conclusion that's being drawn, right? That's the question we have to ask for an argument from analogy. Are the similarities that are cited relevant to the conclusion that's being drawn? And they're really here, right? So arguments from analogy can sometimes, it's really easy to go wrong with them, right? Because arguments from analogy are rarely persuasive to those who don't already agree. They'll see a false analogy, right? The people who agree with you are going to say, oh, that's a great argument, that's a brilliant analogy. But people who disagree with the conclusion are liable to say, oh, that's a false analogy. The similarities that you're citing are not relevant to the conclusion that you are drawing. Anyway, but to evaluate an argument from analogy for strength, here's the question you want to ask. You want to ask how relevant the similarities cited in the premises are to the similarity cited in the conclusion. Our next inductive form is inference to the best explanation. And inference to the best explanation, well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It argues that a particular explanation is the best one available. And it requires an argument, right? Remember, an explanation by itself is not an argument, even though an explanation sometimes uses the same indicator word. Okay? All right. So induction by enumeration. Induction by enumeration allows us to generalize from a sample to a population. And the standard form is some percentage of a sample of members of group A are also members of group B. So, approximately the same percentage of all members of group A are members of group B. Okay? And in this problem, this percentage could be as low as 0 or as high as 100%. Okay? So as any possible probability value is acceptable. Okay? Now, but in order for an induction by enumeration to be strong, the sample must be both random and sufficiently large. Random, here's another technical word in our class. For a sample is random if and only if every member of the population is equally likely to be a member of the sample. Okay? If a sample is not random, then it is biased. Right? If some group within the population is more or less likely to be surveyed, then the sample is biased for or against that group respectively. Okay? Sufficiently large. Well, how large does the sample need to be? In general, the bigger the better, but it costs more to get a bigger sample. And pollsters, say, who are trying to figure out what a sample is like, don't want to waste their money. And generally, the sample is bigger the better, but it's generally not. Okay? The Literary Digest had gotten a biased sample because they had surveyed from auto registrations and telephone registrations. They got some of their name from that. And in 1936, what was going on? I hope you just said the Great Depression, and that's right. So at that time, poor people didn't have cars, and sometimes they didn't even have phones. So they missed the poor people, right? The people who were rich in 1936 had a mild preference for Alf Landon, but the poor people overwhelmingly voted to re-elect President Roosevelt, and they were simply missed in the polls. The poll had missed them. Okay? So you might ask, what is the margin of error? Well, the margin of error, remember I used that word approximately. Well, the margin of error for a sample size n is approximately equal to plus or minus 1 divided by the square root of n. Notice that's an approximation. If you take a statistics course, you're going to get a more complicated formula. But the number you'll get is always going to be pretty close to that. So this is going to get you in the ballpark of the thing, right? You can look at the more complicated expression in statistics class. Here's the cool thing about that. That's the margin of error regardless of the size of the population. Okay? And remember, like I said, you'll get a more complicated formula in statistics class, but it will still be independent of the population size. Okay? That's as long as we're making the assumption that the population is significantly larger than the sample that we're making, right? If the sample size is close to the population size, the margin of error will actually be smaller. And of course, if you sample every member of the population, the margin of error will be 0. You'll have the exact amount. Okay, so that's kind of the, but you know, the margin of error won't be any bigger than that. Okay. However, because of this, modern polls are usually much smaller than the ones used in 1936. Right? Typically, a pollster will survey about 2,000 people, in which case the margin of error will come out to be about 2%. Now, what happens to inductive and deductive arguments when we learn something new? So, let's add some new information to arguments that we recently considered, the arguments that we just saw, and let's see whether this changes our evaluation of the argument. Let's suppose that we learned something new about Bill. That's Bill who downloaded music, or who might download music. Okay, now, here are our premises. 75% of Golden West students download music. Bill is a Golden West student. Now here comes our new bit of information. Bill is deaf. Our conclusion is still Bill downloads music. Now, let's ask how this new information has changed the argument. Is the argument valid or invalid? Well, clearly the argument is still invalid, right? This new information that Bill is deaf doesn't change that. Is the argument strong or weak? Well, think about this. This new bit of information that Bill is deaf, at the very least, seems to weaken the argument. Okay? Because if 3/4 of students download music and 1/4 doesn't it seem likely that if Bill is deaf, that Bill is more likely a part of the 1/4 that doesn't than the 3/4 who do download music? Okay, so we think that the argument, I think, is probably weak, and at the very least we can say that adding this new bit of information weakens the argument. Okay, you might ask, well, how much does it weaken the argument? Well, to figure that out, we have to use a formula called Bayes' theorem, which is a great important result in mathematics, but we're trying to do this without the probability theory, so we're just going to skip that for now. Is the argument still a statistical syllogism? The answer to that is yes, it still is. Explain why. How are we going to classify this new statement that Bill is deaf? Statement number 3, that Bill is deaf. Okay, is it a premise? Well, is it a statement offered in support of the conclusion, right? Does this statement offer any support of the conclusion? Well, no, it actually seems to undermine the conclusion. So what it is a discount. A discount is a statement that's similar to a premise, except that it tends to undermine the conclusion. You might ask yourself, well, why would anybody ever offer a discount, right? If the purpose of an argument is to convince someone of the conclusion, which it often is, why would you ever acknowledge information that tends to go against the conclusion? Well, think about it, because there's a good reason for that, right? I think that you might be able to figure it out if we look at the discount indicators. Notice that these discount indicators are a third family of indicator words and phrases, right? We've already learned conclusion indicators, and we've already learned about premise indicators. These discount indicators indicate that what comes next is an acknowledgement of evidence against the conclusion, and here are some common discount indicators. Although, even though, despite, in spite of, while I know that, while I admit that, while I had realized that. Notice that these, like most discount indicators, come before the discount. The next two are tricky. Yes, but, right? Or yes, however. Notice that the discount actually goes after the word yes, but before the word but or however, right? So oftentimes we'll find a discount before the word but, before the word however. That's because you want to get the discount out of the way, right? The discount's the bitter pill, the thing you need to acknowledge that you don't really want to, but you have to acknowledge it. So that's what the discount is doing for you. So you want to get it out of the way, and then you want to get onto the good stuff, the stuff that you're really trying to get across to the reader. So discounts are an important part of good writing because you're acknowledging that there's an opposing point of view that you're aware of. So now here's my tip about how to write a good thesis. In addition to your conclusion, also include a discount. Notice that a thesis is like the conclusion, but it's a little bit bigger. So you include the discount indicated by a word like although, right? The discount indicates an opposing point of view that you're going to have to criticize in your paper, right? The opposing point of view should be interesting. And here's a tip to writing a good paper. It will help you a lot to find a good source to disagree with, okay? It's easy to find sources that we agree with. The challenge is to find a good source that you can disagree with. Okay? And you can disagree with it and then respectfully say why that source is wrong. Now, if you're unable to articulate a discount, there's a good chance that you have a trivial thesis and your paper is not going to be very interesting. Okay? Think about that the next time you have to write a term paper. Okay? Anyway, now let's see what happens when we discount a valid argument. Now let's consider this argument. 100% of Golden West students download music. Bill is a Golden West student. Bill is deaf. That's our new bit of information. So Bill downloads music. Let's ask ourselves this. How does this new information change the argument? Is the argument valid or invalid? Notice, the argument is still valid, right? Adding the discount has not changed anything about the valid argument. The argument is not any stronger or any weaker when the discount is added. It's still a valid argument. The argument in this case really wasn't changed by the discount at all. So here are some more differences between induction and deduction, right? Inductive form does not ensure strength, right? So even though a valid form does ensure validity, and we can still have a weak statistical syllogism, right? Remember, since a discount is not a premise, it's still a syllogism. We still only really have two premises there, so it was still a syllogism, right? So remember, every valid form with an argument is valid, but it's possible for a strong inductive form to actually be a weak argument. Okay? And when evaluating an inductive argument for strength, one must consider all the relevant evidence. And if an arguer knows of a discount but leaves it out of an inductive argument, then what she is guilty of a fallacy. She's guilty of something she committed, cherry picking. Right? Cherry picking, another technical term in our class. Cherry picking means selectively presenting evidence that favors your conclusion and ignoring evidence against your conclusion. It's also known as suppressing evidence or the fallacy of incomplete evidence. Notice that this is an inductive fallacy. It doesn't apply to valid arguments. The arguments are valid. The discounts don't matter, but they do matter to inductive arguments. In an inductive argument, you need to present all the relevant evidence. If you don't do that, you've been cherry picking. Now, don't confuse discounts with hedges. Discounts are often confused with hedges. Okay? Discounts are a common part of good writing. Now, the big difference is discounts are a common part of good writing. Hedges are a common part of bad writing. Let's think about this. What does it mean to hedge? What does it mean to hedge your bets? Okay? What's an example of hedging your bets? Well, let me give you an example, okay, of a bet that I'm making. Okay? There's a bet that I'm making. Okay, you might expect your critical thinking teacher to tell you that gambling is for suckers, and generally that's true. But here's an example of a bet that I'm making. Okay, a bet that's for a lot of money, and the bet that I'm making is called term life insurance. Now, you might say, wait a second, term life insurance, what has to happen in order for me to win my bet? That's right, I have to die. Now, do I want to win my bet, or do I want to lose my bet? That's right, I want to lose my bet. Okay. Notice I'm hedging my bets because even though I put a little bit of money into life insurance, I put a lot more into my retirement savings. Right, my retirement savings are a bet that I'm going to live, but I realize, well, that might not hold up. Right, I want to have something on the other side, so I also have life insurance that's I'm hedging my bet in case I die. Okay, because because if I do die, my family is going to have enough problems. I don't want them to have a financial catastrophe on top of everything else. Anyway, let's talk about now in writing, right? Hedges. A hedge indicates a lack of confidence in a statement or argument, okay? So some examples of hedges are perhaps, maybe, possibly, I believe that, I think that, it seems to me, it could be so, it might be the case that. Notice that these are the hedges themselves, not the hedge indicators. Now, what's wrong with these? The problem with hedges, as you could probably tell from the tone of my voice, is that hedges make your writing sound wimpy. You want to argue the strongest thesis you can. You want to argue it as forcefully as you can. Now, you want to acknowledge weaknesses in your thesis, but you do that with discounts. That's why discounts are good and hedges are bad. Now, there's 3 hedges that are especially problematic. Each one of these has a specific problem. And as I say each one out loud, I want you to try and imagine what the problem is. In my opinion, I'd guess that, I feel that. Avoid these in your writing. Let me tell you what's wrong with each one of these. You could probably tell. First thing, why should you never say, in my opinion, in a paper that you're writing? Well, the reason is that it was your job to give your opinion. I know that it's your opinion because it's your name on the paper. So you don't have to say, in my opinion, that's superfluous. The only time that I would make an exception to that is if you're comparing your opinion with that of, say, the opinion of one of your sources. And they're similar, but there's a possibility of confusion. Then you could say, in my opinion, this is the case, but in the author's opinion, this other thing is the case. So you could use it in that case, but that's kind of an exception. Normally, you wouldn't even want to do that. The problem with I guess that is you shouldn't guess. Don't guess, know. And if you don't know, find out. There's this great building here on this campus. It's called the library. And there's a librarian there who will be happy to help you find out. Okay? There's this also cool thing. It's called the internet. And of course, the internet has a lot of misinformation on it too. But part of being a critical thinker in the 21st century is to try and find to separate the gems from let's say the crap on the internet. Okay, we want to try and do that. And the problem with saying that I feel that is, well, I don't care how you feel. Okay, I care about what you can argue for. Right? Give me your best argument. Don't tell me how you feel. Assurances. Okay. The assurance is the opposite of a hedge. A word or phrase that indicates confidence in a statement or argument is called an assurance, right? You're trying to assure the reader of something. And even though I said that hedges are bad, their opposite assurances are really just as bad. They're not any better writing, so in general, we want to avoid them. Well, you might say, what's wrong with expressing confidence? Didn't you just say you should argue the boldest thesis that you can? Yes, but if you argue it boldly, you won't need an assurance. Let me give you some examples of some assurances, okay? Obviously, certainly, clearly. It's a fact that. It is well known that. Only a fool could doubt that. Okay, I hope that now that I've said these, you can kind of see what's wrong with them, right? Each one of these is an attempt to replace argument with bluster. You want to argue the thing for the best, because the problem with this is if something is obvious, it's obvious that it's obvious, and you don't need to say it. And the obviousness will speak for itself. If something is clear, it's clear that it's clear, and the clarity will speak for itself. It's a fact that. Saying that really doesn't add anything to a sentence. It is well known that. Okay? Notice these last two are really attempts to bully the reader into accepting something when you haven't given a good argument for it. It is well known that. When I read something like that, I think, well, why don't I know it? Maybe it's not so well known. If I read only a fool could doubt that, well, I think, well, wait a second. Actually, I doubt it. You haven't convinced me. Are you calling me a fool? It kind of insults your reader instead of convinces your reader. Okay? So, like I said, that's because they often add bluster or intimidation. Some books call them proof substitutes. Instead of giving a proof or an argument, you use them as assurances. Okay, use them sparingly, if at all. They're too common in student writing. Okay, and I hope this lecture has helped you understand the difference between inductive and deductive logic with a little bit of rhetoric thrown in. Thank you.